Hey, how you doing? Today is the 14th of January 2021 and Notcast episode 45. I can't believe I'm on 45 episodes already and I've been doing this stuff for 3 months. It's going to be about U2 and what happened in the years 1994, 1995 and 1996. Now, where we last met our intrepid bunch of Irish bazillionaires was with the release of this album, Zooropa, and the subsequent tour that went with it. And of course, what you may not necessarily know is what happened next. Well, first and foremost, as you will see, the cover of Zooropa is a baby inside an astronaut helmet, known colloquially by some as Cosmo. And Russian for Cosmo is, of course, Cosmos. And after from Cosmos, where U2 went next, was Space, baby. Although we don't quite get to this. This album is by a band called Passengers, and Passengers is the only album by them. It's the 4 members of U2 and Brian Eno, the band's producer and general all-round musical wunderkind, making a soundtrack to a series of imaginary films with the remit of make music for the future you want to live in. Now, soundtracks were a big deal in the 90s. Not going to be ambiguous about that. Soundtrack album was part and parcel of many a big movie. And you might think, oh, that doesn't necessarily, why would people buy soundtrack albums to films? Well, often soundtrack albums to films are just actually compilations of lots and lots of pre-existing material put together relatively cheaply with the hope that people would buy it. And of course, one of the first and perhaps the Stanley Kubrick's was Stanley Kubrick was very, what's the word I'm thinking of here? He was very good at using what he called needle drops, which was pre-existing musical material, and putting it into soundtrack albums. So when you watch Stanley Kubrick films and you watch 2001 or The Shining or A Clockwork Orange, it's all pre-existing material that's been slotted in. In fact, 2001 was originally due to have its own bespoke musical score by a conductor called Alex North that was abandoned because Stanley Kubrick didn't like it. He preferred using the music from the temp tracks, which was classical performances of material like Auto Spac, Zarathustra, and other things which I can't pronounce. And here I am, of course, showing that being an English person is I'm very good at speaking English. I'm not very good at speaking any language that isn't English, because that's how the English and the Americans think, in the same way that, the World Baseball Championships is the World Baseball Championships because pretty much no other country would ever play it. The British speaking people like to think of themselves as the dominant cultural people in all over the world and humanity, and etc. Now, soundtrack albums are a big deal in the 90s, in the 80s. Compilations of pre-existing material. They'd throw together new stuff, and you get awful compilations of pop rock soundtracks with titles like Burning Hearts and No Easy Way Out by artists like Kenny Loggins and Survivor. Actually, without even knowing, Kenny Loggins sings a song called Double or Nothing, Kenny Loggins and Gladys Knight on Rocky IV, which I hadn't really thought about. But movie soundtracks in the 80s were often just excuses to put together really bland pop rock albums of specially recorded material by artists with lots of saxophones, specifically films like Beverly Hills Cop, Rocky IV, Over the Top. And you end up watching films like those and you end up going, that bit of soundtrack is just there just to put it on a soundtrack album. But of course, some of the best soundtrack albums of all time are Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, both of which featured exclusive tracks. So if you wanted to get a new song from Faith No More, you had to buy the soundtrack to Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, which, by the way, was originally going to be called Bill and Ted Go to Hell. If you wanted to get the song Revolution, which R.E.M. performed on every single night of their Monster Tour, you had to buy the soundtrack CD to this truly appalling Batman movie, Batman and Robin, which also featured R. Kelly, Bone Thugs and Harmony, Jewel. God, there's some right shit on this. Sorry, guys. There's also Underworld and R.E.M. and the Smashing Pumpkins, so all is not yet lost. But the soundtrack album has really taken a bit of a dip in terms of a compilation of previously unreleased material, because these days, if you want to get one song by a particular band that you might like, you just stream it on Spotify. There's no point spending £12.99 on a fancy silver CD to get a single song by a band when you just stream it on Spotify for all the times you're going to live with it. But the soundtrack album still remains a valid form of creating a new and unusual musical atmosphere. Hence, things like Quentin Tarantino's Death Proof. This is in the really quite bizarre leather wallet sleeve. And as you've already heard and seen, and I've mentioned previously, the soundtrack to Wim Wenders' film Until the End of the World, which has a song called Until the End of the World by a band called the U2s, which you've probably heard of, and previously unreleased material by REM and Depeche Mode. I think one of the last original Talking Heads songs, Sax and Violins, and I'll Love You Until the End of the World by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. And even something like the soundtrack to The Beach, which came out in the year 2000. This is, by the way, if you've heard All Saints doing Pure Shores, it comes from this soundtrack album, which is pretty surprising when you think about it. Soundtrack albums, really, really big deal. And of course, U2 are never going to be the type of people that are going to miss an opportunity to throw a couple of unusual songs onto a soundtrack album. Following the end of the Zooropa tour in 1993 in Japan, the band still continued working, although they started working more separately as individuals. And we saw this in the Name of the Father by Bono and Gavin Friday, which really does sound like a U2 B-side. It takes all the musical groundwork that's been laid by Zooropa, and it continues on with a spoken word part by Gavin, and production I think by Nelly Hooper. No, Tim Simonian and Gavin Friday. Recording engineer was Paul Barrett, who'd worked with U2 a lot of the times. It sounds like a U2 song that U2 don't play on, if that makes any sense, and it could easily have been a B-side from the Zooropa period. There's also a soundtrack album to In the Name of the Father, which has some solo tracks by Bono in it, and it's also got a song called I think You Made Me the Thief of Your Heart, performed by Sinead O'Connor, which was written by Bono. But of course, 1994 was the year where the band did not very much at all. They generally, scattered to the four winds. Adam started taking bass lessons and lived in New York. Larry started taking drum lessons. I don't quite know what the Edge was up to, and Bono was obviously making soundtrack stuff. But it all kind of coalesced when the band went back into the studio in November 1994 and started work on some new material. And the first fruits of that new material were released in early 1995 with Hold Me, Thrill Me, Kiss Me, Kill Me, which is a song that was originally worked up and written in the Zooropa era. Here's the red vinyl 7-inch single, backed with, somewhat bizarrely, the theme from Batman by, I think, Elliot Goldenthal. But this was a big hit for the band, and it's basically built upon the song or the version of the song that they wrote during the Zooropa period. And so during the Zooropa period, as I mentioned in the previous video, when the band were coming to the end of the Zooropa recording, they decided to concentrate on the less guitar-y songs and hold the guitar-y songs back for the next album. And if you look through the sleeve art to Zooropa, you can see that there's allusions to songs called If You Wear That Velvet Dress, Wake Up Dead Man, and Hold Me, Thrill Me, Kiss Me, Kill Me, all of which were to appear later on. And Hold Me, Thrill Me, Kiss Me, Kill Me, big hit. Here's a CD single, sold tons of copies, and the band have been performing it on and off live. It made an appearance on the 2018 Innocence and Experience, or Experience of Innocence tour, although in a remixed form during the intermission. But Hold Me, Thrill Me, Kiss Me, Kill Me is a big, stumpy, kind of like Bowie influenced T-Rexy type song. Really kind of stomps along, and it doesn't sound anything like anything that the band have done before. It's quite very cinematic. It's like a follow-on from the Zoo TV period. Kind of gives you a hint of where the band are going next, but the band never went there, because as you'll see, lots and lots of bands hit what I call a crisis of confidence, and I think this is something that maybe U2 did have and they didn't have at the same time. So when bands have been going for about 20 years, so if you're in a band that formed in 1976, if you're in The Cure, that formed around about 1976, U2 formed in 1976, Depeche Mode that formed in about 1979, what you'll find is that when you get to around about 20 years in your band's career, you hit a road bump in your life, and what you're not sure is, is this over? Or is this going to carry on? And there's a bit of navel gazing around that. You're asking yourself questions like, well, is this who I am, or is this who I used to be? And And you can think about, Depeche Mode in the mid-90s were practically defunct. Alan had left the band. Dave Garn was, to all intents and purposes, a professional drug addict. Martin Gore was having a bit of writer's block and having difficulty writing material. The Cure were just about to launch Wild Mood Swings, which was commercially unsuccessful, and saw them playing, half-empty venues where previously they'd sold 3 nights at the same venue 4 years before. And I think part of that is because people had changed. Most people, when they get into bands, they start being into bands. You get into bands and gangs and you're the age of 15, 16, 17, and this band could be your life. And then what happens is that other things happen. Jobs happen, love happens, mortgages happen, kids happen, career happens. And you start to wonder, well, is this just the music that reminds me of who I used to be when I was younger, or is this music going to help me navigate my way through the rest of my life? And what bands will tend to find about 20 years in is generally, unless you're bringing new fans in with every release, is that your fan base tends to shrink, or as Spinal Tap say it, they're more selective. Some people, they just don't buy your records. They don't come and see your gigs because they've had a hard day at work and the kids want you to go and watch them play basketball or amateur night or piano or whatever, and you have to do something. Or maybe that's a night that you go and play golf. I don't know who plays golf apart from the soon-to-be ex-president and bigly impeached Donald Trump. But that's one of those things, is that you get to a point where if you've been in a band for 20 years, you see your fan base will start to change. They'll either grow older with you or they'll grow older doing something else, and sometimes that can be something like house renovations. And at the moment, obviously, there are no gigs to go to, there are no pubs to go to, there's no golf because it's January and outside it's like being in a horror movie set in winter. It's like The Thing out there. I feel like I'm in Outpost 31. But as the band changes over time, less people care. And if the music that you make doesn't grow, it doesn't mature, it doesn't change, you're forever, the wasp stuck in amber that never grows up, never matures, and then you end up like Def Leppard, and every single song is pretty much the same as every other song. And you listen to a song like, I don't know, let's say Euphoria from the Euphoria album, which I think is either 1999 or 2002. And it sounds just like a B-side from 1987, but not as good as the B-sides from 1987. And then the question you ask yourself is, what's the point? Are this band making music because that's their job? Or are they making music because that's what they want to do? Are they making music because that's what they care about? Or are they making music because that pays for the gardener? Difficult, lemon, difficult, lemon, difficult. And this is the kind of thing that both Depeche Mode and The Cure had in the mid-90s as well. Is that period where they don't quite know what they're going to do next. Of course, what U2 decided to do next was to go to space, baby. Space. And they recorded an album with Brian Eno under the name of Passengers, Original Soundtracks 1. Now, the cover for this is, I think, from a 1963 book called 6 Days on Luna 1, which I think came from Prague. So they're still tapping into the madness and nonsense of Zooropa. They're taking all the conceptions that you have about what a sincere rock band is, and they're throwing it away, and they're going, well, actually, we can go anywhere, we can do anything, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to do something new, we're going to go somewhere else, we're going to go in places you don't expect us to be, and we're going to go and make music that pleases us. Now, Passengers is in my opinion, a U2 record, although it isn't officially or contractually a U2 record, because every single member of U2 plays on the vast majority of the songs. The band have played 2 songs from this live. They played a song called Miss Sarajevo, and they played Your Blue Room. And they've both done that in the past 10 or 11 years. Bono sings on a number of the songs. You can clearly hear that it's U2 all the way through it like a stick of rock. It just happens to be that Brian Eno is part of that band and he's directing the band. So whereas previously maybe Brian was an employee whose job was to tease out from U2 what those songs were, here he's in the room, and as Bono said, they made Brian Eno the captain and they made themselves available to record the material. And so Passengers comes from about 25 hours of instrumental improvisations that the band recorded in late 1994 in London, and some of it also at their newly purchased and kitted out HQ studios in Dublin. and that material then became, refined, honed, and edited, and turned into these finished songs. I rate this very highly. I think I'd put this probably about 7 in my list of U2 albums, and for my purposes, there are 15 U2 albums, which includes Passengers. So, which means, and I know some of you will not believe this, I rate this higher, and I prefer it to the Joshua Tree. It's not better than the Joshua Tree. I know it's not better than the Joshua Tree. I just prefer it. I listen to it more. It resonates more with who I am, as opposed to the perhaps very sincere chest beating of the earlier albums. And it's just weird, and it takes no prisoners, and it does whatever it wants to do, because at this point the band could do whatever they like. Now, Passengers, by the way, contractually isn't a U2 album. The agreement with Island Records is that it wouldn't be called U2, and there were label reps that were out there checking to make sure people weren't putting stickers on it in the shop saying this is really U2, or there weren't billboards or anything, so people weren't buying the album expecting the sequel to Zooropa. As far as I'm concerned, this album is not the sequel to Zooropa, or in fact the prequel to Pop, but it's more like a compilation of previously unreleased B-sides from Zooropa and Pop. And you listen to the B-sides on the Unforgettable Fire album, things like Bass Trap, 60 Seconds in Kingdom Come. It's clearly the same band here. It's got the same textures, the same atmospheres, the same abstract approach, the experimentation with sound, but it's just very bloody weird. You could put the soundtrack that Bono and Edge did for the Clockwork Orange stage production in 1990, and it would slot right into and around this material. This material is recorded with the aim of being the soundtrack to imaginary films, but the problem was when the band were recording it, they had nothing to watch. They had no images, so they had to think and imagine what those films might be. Now, the original idea, as I understood it, is to write a soundtrack to go alongside a 1996 film by Peter Greenaway, which I think was called The Pillow Book. That idea fell to the side, and so the band carried on with the material and came up with this album. And it's a sequel of sorts to Eno's 1976 album, Music for Imaginary Films. And again, it asks the same questions which I've mentioned the other bands had when they get to this point in their career, which is, where do I go? What do I do? Who am I? What kind of artistic identity have I got? And it's not creative bankruptcy, but it's actually complete freedom, untethered from the restrictions of what a album or a song might be. But they're still very song-based in terms of structure. And the idea was just how far out can you go before you lose your way back home? That is the thing that they've got here, and they go pretty damn far out into the universe with this. And to me, it also reminds me a lot of the instrumental sides of Bowie's Heroes and Low, which Eno was involved with. And Eno was, never been one to be afraid to tell a band to experiment. And the thing about experiments is often they fail. And when you have an experiment, as U2 learnt with Pop later on, is that the experiment teaches you how to fail or how not to succeed, as opposed to going down into the well and finding gold every time. Sometimes you come out and you get fool's gold, or you get nothing at all. But the important thing is not the point of the journey is not to arrive, as Rush had it. The point of the journey is what you learnt upon the way, and obviously they went a heck of a long way out into nowhere, and somehow found their way back with this record. As I said, it was 25 hours of instrumental improvisation and jams. There was no images to watch, there was no clearly formed songs, and this was where technology really allowed people to go through that. So you could record for hours on end, and then you could feed the whole thing into a computer, and you could move and edit, and you could lock bars, and you could change things around, and you could create loops. And so in fact, it may be that there's a track on here, I think it's Let's Go Native, which is a or maybe it's The Swan, which is this grinding, repetitive, monotonous beat. I'm not convinced the band played that song for more than about a minute, but it's just been looped and looped, and then textures have been added over it, which, if you listen to the various different versions of Salome on the 3 CD from 1991, or the 4 LP of the new and unreleased, unrehearsed, rehearsals, new versions, it's the same kind of thing, where actually the band aren't necessarily playing. What you're listening to is one member of the band improvising over a loop of the band already playing. And you know, that's a fascinating way to create a song, but also it's very boring. It takes forever. And if you're not careful, you end up with an album like Chinese Democracy, where people are playing together that have never actually met. And it's a kind of a weird kind of way of making an album. Now, as I've said, you know, the ultimate editor in any creative enterprise is actually in the brain. It's the thing that tells you where to put the camera or what words to write, and what you leave out is just as important as what you leave in. And here, you know, these songs were not necessarily created by a band, they were edited together from longer other sections, almost like the audio equivalent of a film. Now, a film is only ever a series of random still images that exist. You know, that somehow our brain coheres into making sense around a narrative and around cohesion and around continuity and all that type of stuff. An album is the same thing. It's an assortment of sound, and that's where the word album comes from, because albums were originally collections of 10-inch discs played at 78 RPM on shellac that maybe got one song on a side, and an album was when you put 5 of those discs together and you created 10 songs and you created an album, like a photo album. That is what an album is, and that is what this album is. It's a compilation of weird and unusual material from the band. And the more song-based material that came out through this, I think, ended up on the U2 album Pop. The less song-based material started to be turned into this kind of material. It was U2, but it didn't sound like U2. So it was almost like someone had taken the most U2-ish elements of the DNA out, and this is what you listen to. Now, if you want to think about that from another perspective, if you go on the internet, someone has taken an MP3 and a WAV of the same music file, and they've played back the music file, but with the bits that the MP3 leaves out, and only the bits that the MP3 leaves out, and you can still hear the song in there, you just can't hear it in the midst of everything else. And this is what the band were doing here, is that they were taking bits away to make it less and less U2. So for example, Edge sings on Corpse for the first time. I think he does a lead vocal since Van Diemen's Land in 1988. Brian Eno sings on I think A Different Kind of Blue, which was the first time in about 20 years that Eno had sung a lead vocal. And it, you know, tied into, and you can hear the, you know, the building blocks of this, as I've said before, in the Unforgettable Fire B-sides. You can also hear it in Edge's Heroin soundtrack. This is, you know, what the band did next after that, and it's part pop, it's part Zooropa, it's a weird Franken album. I love it to bits, but it's not by any stretch the one to go to. If you go, well, I want to start listening to U2, but I don't know what to listen to, I don't know where to start, not this one, guys. This isn't the one to listen to. Okay, even if you love Achtung Baby and Zooropa, this is a tough meal to swallow. It's an acquired taste, and not everyone has acquired that taste. And it's more kind of a selection of moods. Now, there's a couple of songs on here that really sound like they could be on the next U2 album. United Colours, for example, is an instrumental track. It picks up exactly, if you put this on straight after Zooropa as Wanderer fades out, and you put United Colours back on, you go, these are the B-sides. You know, and a completely legitimate way of listening to it. It sounds like the next step on from Zooropa. And there's Slug and Your Blue Room, and then there is Miss Sarajevo, and those are the 3 songs that most sound like U2. They sound like U2 B-sides. Miss Sarajevo sounds like an A-side because it is, and it was a single later on. They're fantastic tracks, which really should be better known. Miss Sarajevo, by the way, was released as a single, which was the only Passengers single that was officially released. It was issued as a 7-inch in a 12-inch poster pack, so you could open this out. 7-inch single comes inside here, then you take the poster out, and the poster is effectively the image of, and I've not opened this poster for an extremely long time indeed, in the days when you had to. So the poster is effectively, you know, the image of the women from the Miss Sarajevo competition, and it's a really unusual package, but it's a really unusual record. And in fact, you know, there's a 7-inch single, but a lot of people don't even know that this is a U2 or U2 related track. They only know it when they, you know, hear it played by U2 occasionally, or on the you know, the best of album which U2 has, which has this. So as far as I'm concerned, because U2 have included Miss Sarajevo on their best of and at their live shows, it isn't a cover of a Passengers track, it's a Passengers track, but it's a U2 song, that is a U2 album. And I think the proof of that is in the pudding, because it says music by passengers, which is Brian Eno, Bono, Adam Clayton, The Edge, Larry Mullen Jr., an extra passenger, Luciano Pavarotti. And Pavarotti sings an operatic vocal in the end of the song, which would never fit into a U2 song. But it just takes the song, it just takes it in a completely different direction. And the lyrics that he's got for that are brilliant. So, I mean, if you wanted to think about, what the lyrics are when he's singing that Italian section, by the way, what he sings is, "You say the river, find the way to the sea. It's like the river, you will come to me, beyond the borders and the thirsty lands. You say that like the river, love will come, and I don't know how to pray anymore. And in love, I no longer know how to hope, and that love, I can't wait any longer." And that's, yeah, Pavarotti singing that, it doesn't sound sincere to me. It sounds like a guy showing off about how amazing his vocal pipes are, in the same way that when Whitney Houston sings "I Will Always Love You," I'm not impressed. We've got somebody that's technically brilliant, but it doesn't sound sincere to me. Sometimes it's the fact that the singer can't sing very well and his voice cracks and it doesn't hit notes correctly. That's what makes it sincere to me, because he's trying to move through the limitations that he's got of his voice. But those are great lyrics. And Miss Sarajevo and Passengers is a U2 album in all but name. And if you seriously love U2, you've got to give this album a listen. You've got to try it, you've got to own it. I think you can get it on Amazon for about £1.24 on CD. Vinyl is considerably more expensive because it's the only U2 related album with all the members of U2 on that hasn't been repressed or reissued. So it was released on vinyl in the UK and in the US. I think copies are about £70 or £80 now, which is a ridiculous amount of money for it. It really should be reissued, and of course, like all U2's reissues and repressings, it should be available on a strange colour of vinyl, because that's how they do things these days, to sell you things you don't, or sell you things you already own in new packages by pressing it on a slightly different colour of vinyl. But it's worthy of recognition as an official U2 record, in my opinion. And, these were meant to be soundtracks for imaginary films. Now, go into the inner sleeve, and if you want to get a little cheeky about it, there's an inner sleeve in here that gives a story to each one of the films that this is meant to be in. Some of them are true, by the way, and some of them are complete nonsense and lies. So Beyond the Clouds, which is for, I think, Your Blue Room, that film really exists. Always Forever Now was licensed to a film called Heat by Michael Mann in a slightly different mix. And that's a great film, but that's a Mann's film, and we're going to talk about that probably in an episode about my favourite Michael Mann movies. Also, we have got Miss Sarajevo itself, which comes from the documentary by Bill Carter around the Miss Sarajevo beauty pageant. I'm surprised Donald Trump wasn't there, to be honest. And then 1 Minute Warning comes from Ghost in the Shell, which is here. And there is an alternate mix of Ghost in the Shell that was released on the soundtrack album as well. But also, the films that don't exist that are on here, for example, you have a character called Von Heineken, which is a direct allusion to Paul McGuinness. Some of the other names that we see on here are anagrams. And I'd like to thank U2 Songs for doing all the hard work for me, which I'm going to read from a screen here so I can pretend that I knew this all along. So what we've got actually is that the names of some of the people that are on here, so the people that penned the sleeve notes here included Ben O'Ryan and CSJ Beaufop. And Ben O'Ryan is an anagram of Brian Eno, and CSJ Beaufop is what happens if you take the letters in the words Brian and Eno, shove them forward one, and then rearrange them into an anagram. Venda Davis is mentioned here, which is an anagram of David Evans, which is the real name of The Edge. Tanya McLeod becomes Adam Clayton. Barry Bouders becomes Des Broadbury, who played Sequencer on Always Forever Now. P. Hewson is the phonetic spelling of Paul Hewson, which is Bono's real name. Tony Corbin, who is mentioned as the actor in Hypnotise Me, Love Me Until Dawn, which is one of the films that doesn't exist on here, is clearly an allusion to Anton Corbin. And the whole thing is basically a huge piss take. It's very, very dry. but it's very, very rewarding. I think this is a hidden gem in U2's catalogue, and if you love the band, you really got to give this album a listen, especially if you like the weird stuff. And bearing in mind U2 don't make albums very often, this is a nice way of keeping the band fresh if you haven't heard it before. So that was Passengers, and there's another song which is on there which I want to mention. This is the Japanese CD edition, by the way, and there's two songs I'm going to mention out here. One is Elvis Ate America, which is track 11, and that has Howie B all over it, and Howie B later became an important part of the Pop album. But Elvis Ate America is based on a poem by Bono, which is available on YouTube and has been on television a couple of times, and it's probably my least favourite U2 song, because it's just not very good. It's a very dull, repetitive, very insular piece of music that just repeats the same thing for about 4 minutes with someone going Elvis, and then Bono goes about white trash, the Memphis Flash would have been a sissy if he hadn't met Johnny Cash, etc., etc. And it's just, I don't like it. It's not good enough to be on an album. And it's got a pretty dodgy use of a couple of pretty dodgy words on it, words which would now get censored, by the way. Now, it's not U2. It probably alienated a lot of fans, this album. If you weren't on board with Acton Baby and Zooropa, this one stomps on your feet and kicks you into the ocean and then drags you down to the ocean floor. It is the weirdest thing that U2 have done by a country mile. And if you weren't sure about Zooropa, you will hate this. You absolutely will. I'm not going to pretend for a second that you won't. You'll hate it. But if you think, well, I'd quite like to listen to some B-sides from the Pop and Zooropa eras that are a bit weird, well worth picking up. Now, the Japanese version of the album contains some extra tracks, and the one which I'm going to most obviously mention is track 15, Bottoms, which is a remix of Zoo Station, where somebody just lets Brian Eno loose on the board, and it's a great little remix of Zoo Station that goes full on weird and well worth your time. But luckily you don't have to have the Japanese version of the album. The CD single, which is generally extremely very cheap indeed, features Bottoms on it. It features an extra track called Viva Da Divoff, and it features an orchestral version of One performed by Bono, Edge and Brian Eno that is absolutely well worth listening. If you go, well, I want to hear what it sounds like when Bono sings with an orchestra and he sings One, this is the one to get. Also, probably dirt cheap on Amazon as well, probably about 60p. Not that I've looked that up. Now, that takes us out of the Passengers album, which, as I've said before, is, in my opinion, better than the Joshua Tree. Don't at me, girl, you know it's true. The band also carried on with their soundtrack activity, which took a little bit of a left turn, and they recorded an extra couple of songs. Adam and Larry did a solo single, the theme from Mission Impossible, largely as an experiment to see, what they could do and record on their own. Here's a couple of 12 inches of the remixes on Mother Records. I don't know if these are promos. Hang on, this one's DJ, and that one says promo 12-inch DJ 75. So again, promo 12 inches. But the theme from Mission Impossible is exactly what you would expect U2 doing the cover version to the theme of Mission Impossible would be like. And this track, Adam and Larry doing the theme from Mission Impossible, later became the introductory song to the band's next tour, PopMart, although this is the cover of Pop. And I should have pointed out that I don't have all of the bits and pieces of paper together at the moment to show you the PopMart logo. I am, however, wearing a PopMart crew shirt because I can and I felt like it. And I think that's where I'm going to kind of wrap up, because Pop, which is the thing that U2 did next, and has its 24 years this week since the first single from Pop was released. That single was Discotheque, by the way. And that album which followed was Pop. That's what I'm going to talk about in the next U2 related episode, which is to talk about the band's 1997 studio album Pop and the singles that come with it. And I think it's going to be a big episode because there is an awful lot to chew through, and I might actually give the PopMart tour its separate instalment in my life. Now I'm going to wrap up here. thank you for listening to me talk for 35 minutes about U2's album, or the Passengers album original soundtracks. Well, I'm sorry, contractually not U2, but the album Passengers, which every member of U2 performs on almost every song. It's a really great album. I really enjoy it, but I've always liked the weird stuff. The only thing I would change about this album is the sequencing. And as per normal, thanks to the age of Spotify playlists, you can create your own sequence, and I will post it in the comments box underneath the video. In the meantime, if you haven't heard this and you want to hear the weirdest U2 album ever, buy it. Listen to it. Find it on Spotify if you can find it, or YouTube. And just go, oh my god, I had no idea they did this. Because after the Cosmo Baby, U2 went to space, and in some respects they never ever came back. Right, I'm going to stop there. Thank you. Episode 46 next. Not sure what it's going to be about, but as David Bowie said, I'm not sure what I'm going to do next, but I can promise it won't be boring. I can't promise you it won't be boring. What I will promise you is that it will be interesting to me and hopefully to some of you. But in the meantime, as per usual, don't be a dick in the comments, and I will see you again on the next episodes. Adios.